The equites constituted the lower of the two aristocratic classes of ancient Rome, ranking below the patricians, a hereditary caste that monopolized political power during the regal era and during the early republic. A member of the equestrian order was known as an eques. During the Roman kingdom and the first century of the Republic, legionary cavalry was recruited exclusively from the ranks of the patricians, who were expected to provide 6 centuriae of cavalry. Around 400 BC, 12 more centuriae of cavalry were established, and these included non-patricians. Around 300 BC, the Samnite Wars obliged Rome to double the normal annual military levy from 2 to 4 legions, doubling the cavalry levy from 600 to 1,200 horses. Legionary cavalry started to recruit wealthier citizens from outside the 18th century. These new recruits came from the first class of commoners in the centuriate organization and were not granted the same privileges. By the time of the Second Punic War, all the members of the first class of commoners were required to serve as cavalrymen. The presence of equites in the Roman cavalry diminished steadily in the period 288 BC, as only equites could serve as the army's senior officers. As the number of legions proliferated, fewer were available for ordinary cavalry service. After c. 88 BC, equites were no longer drafted into the legionary cavalry, although they remained technically liable to such service throughout the Principate era. They continued to supply the senior officers of the army throughout the Principate, with the exception of the purely hereditary patricians. The equites were originally defined by a property threshold. The rank was passed from father to son, although members of the order who at the regular quinquennial census no longer met the property requirement were usually removed from the order's rolls by the Roman census. In the late Republic, the property threshold stood at 50,000 denarii and was doubled to 100,000 by the Emperor Augustus, roughly the equivalent to the annual salaries of 450 contemporary legionaries. In the later Republican period, Roman senators and their offspring became an unofficial elite within the equestrian order, as senators' ability to engage in commerce was strictly limited by law. The bulk of non-agricultural activities were in the hands of non-senatorial equites. As well as holding large landed estates, equites came to dominate mining, shipping and manufacturing industry. In particular, tax farming companies were almost all in the hands of equites. Under Augustus, the senatorial elite was given formal status with a higher wealth threshold and superior rank and privileges to ordinary equites. During the Principate, equites filled the senior administrative and military posts of the imperial government. There was a clear division between jobs reserved for senators and those reserved for non-senatorial equites, but the career structure of both groups was broadly similar. A period of junior administrative posts in Rome or Italy, followed by a period of military service as a senior army officer, followed by senior administrative and military posts in the provinces. Senators and equites formed a tiny elite of under 10,000 members who monopolized political, military and economic power in an empire of about 60 million inhabitants. During the 3rd century AD, power shifted from the Italian aristocracy to a class of equites who had earned the membership by distinguished military service, often rising from the ranks. Career military officers from the provinces who displaced the Italian aristocrats in the top military posts, and under Diocletian from the top civilian positions also. This effectively reduced the Italian aristocracy to an idle, but immensely wealthy group of large landowners. During the 4th century, the status of equites was debased to insignificance by excessive grants of the rank. At the same time, the ranks of senators were swollen to over 4,000 by the establishment of a second senate in Constantinople and the tripling of the membership of both senates. The senatorial order of the 4th century was thus the equivalent of the equestrian order of the Principate. Regal era. According to Roman legend, Rome was founded by its first king, Romulus, in 753 BC. However, archaeological evidence suggests that Rome did not acquire the character of a unified city-state until California. 625 BC. Roman tradition relates that the Order of Knights was founded by Romulus, who supposedly established a cavalry regiment of 300 men called the Celeres to act as his personal escort, with each of the 3 Roman tribes supplying 100 horse. This cavalry regiment was supposedly doubled in size to 600 men by King Tarquinius Priscus. That the cavalry was increased to 600 during the regal era is plausible, as in the early Republic the cavalry fielded remained 600 strong. However, according to Livy, King Servius Tullius established a further 12 centuriae of Equites, a further tripling of the cavalry. But this is probably anachronistic, as it would have resulted in a contingent of 1,800 horse, incongruously large compared to the heavy infantry, which was probably only 6,000 strong in the late regal period. Instead, the additional 12 centuriae were probably created at a later stage, perhaps around 400 BC, but these new units were political, not in military, most likely designed to admit plebeians to the order of knights. Apparently, equites were originally provided with a sum of money by the state to purchase a horse for military service and for its fodder. This was known as an eques publicus. Mommsen argues that the royal cavalry was drawn exclusively from the ranks of the patricians, the aristocracy of early Rome, which was purely hereditary. Apart from the traditional association of the aristocracy with horsemanship, the evidence for this view is the fact that, during the Republic, 6 centuriae of equites in the comitia centuriata retained the names of the original 6 royal cavalry centuriae. These are very likely the centuriae of patrician nobles in the comitia mentioned by the lexicologist Festus. If this view is correct, it implies that the cavalry was exclusively patrician in the regal period. Early Republic. It is widely accepted that the Roman monarchy was overthrown by a patrician coup, probably provoked by the Tarquin dynasty's populist policies in favor of the plebeian class. Indeed, Alfoldi suggests that the coup was carried out by the Celeres themselves. According to the Fracaro interpretation, when the Roman monarchy was replaced by 2 annually elected praetors, the royal army was divided equally between them for campaigning purposes, which if true explains why a later Polybian legion's cavalry contingent was 300 strong. The 12 additional centuriae ascribed by Livy to Servius Tullius were in reality probably formed around 400 BC. In 403 BC, according to Livy, in a crisis during the siege of Veii, the army urgently needed to deploy more cavalry, and those who possessed equestrian rating but had not yet been assigned public horses volunteered to pay for the horses out of their own pocket. By way of compensation, pay was introduced for cavalry service, as it had already been for the infantry. The persons referred to in this passage were probably members of the 12 new centuriae who were entitled to public horses, but temporarily waived that privilege. Mommsen, however, argues that the passage refers to members of the first class of commoners being admitted to cavalry service in 403 BC for the first time as an emergency measure. If so, this group may be the original so-called equites quo privato, a rank that is attested throughout the history of the Republic. However, due to lack of evidence, the origins and definition of a quo privato equites remain obscure. It is widely agreed that the 12 new centuriae were open to non-patricians. Thus, from this date if not earlier, not all equites were patricians. The patricians, as a closed hereditary caste, steadily diminished in numbers over the centuries, as families died out. Around 450 BC, there are some 50 patrician gents recorded, whereas just 14 remained at the time of Julius Caesar, whose own Lulii clan was patrician. In contrast, the ranks of equites, although also hereditary, were open to new entrants who met the property requirement and who satisfied the Roman census that they were suitable for membership. As a consequence, patricians rapidly became only a small minority of the equestrian order. However, patricians retained political influence greatly out of proportion with the numbers. Until 172 BC, one of the two consuls elected each year had to be a patrician. In addition, patricians may have retained their original 6 centuriae, which gave them a third of the total voting power of the equites. Even though they constituted only a tiny minority of the order by 200 BC, patricians also enjoyed official precedence, such as the right to speak first in senatorial debates, which were initiated by the princeps senatus, a position reserved for patricians. In addition, patricians monopolized certain priesthoods and continued to enjoy enormous prestige. Later Republic. Transformation of state and army. The period following the end of the Latin War and of the Samnite Wars saw the transformation of the Roman Republic from a powerful but beleaguered city-state into the hegemonic power of the Italian peninsula. This was accompanied by profound changes in its constitution and army. Internally, the critical development was the emergence of the Senate as the all-powerful organ of state. By 280 BC, the Senate had assumed total control of state taxation, expenditure, declarations of war, treaties, raising of legions, establishing colonies and religious affairs. In other words, of virtually all political power. From an ad hoc group of advisors appointed by the consuls, the Senate had become a permanent body of c. 300 life peers who, as largely former Roman magistrates, boasted enormous experience and influence. At the same time, the political unification of the Latin nation under Roman rule after 338 BC gave Rome a populous regional base from which to launch its wars of aggression against its neighbors. The grueling contest for Italian hegemony that Rome fought against the Samnite League led to the transformation of the Roman army from the Greek-style hoplite phalanx that it was in the early period to the Italian-style manipular army described by Polybius. It is believed that the Romans copied the manipular structure from their enemies the Samnites, learning through hard experience its greater flexibility and effectiveness in the mountainous terrain of central Italy. It is also from this period that every Roman army that took the field was regularly accompanied by at least as many troops supplied by the socii. Each legion would be matched by a confederate ala, a formation that contained roughly the same number of infantry as a legion, but 3 times the number of horse. Legionary cavalry also probably underwent a transformation during this period, from the light, unarmored horsemen of the early period to the Greek-style armored cuirassiers described by Polybius. As a result of the demands of the Samnite hostilities, a normal consular army was doubled in size to 2 legions, making 4 legions raised annually overall. Roman cavalry in the field thus increased to approximately 1,200 horse, but this now represented only 25% of the army's total cavalry contingent, the rest being supplied by the Italian Confederates. A legion's modest cavalry share of 7% of its 4,500 total strength was thus increased to 12% in a Confederate army, comparable with any other forces in Italy except the Gauls and also similar to those in Greek armies such as Pyrrhus's. Political role. Despite an ostensibly democratic constitution based on the sovereignty of the people, the Roman Republic was in reality a classic oligarchy, in which political power was monopolized by the richest social echelon. Probably by c. 300 BC, the centuriate organization of the Roman citizen body for political purposes achieved the evolved form described by Polybius and Livy. The comitia centuriata was the most powerful people's assembly, as it promulgated Roman laws and annually elected the Roman magistrates, the executive officers of the state, consuls, praetors, aediles and quaestors. In the assembly, the citizen body was divided into 193 centuriae, or voting constituencies. Of these, 18 were allocated to equites and a further 80 to the first class of commoners, securing an absolute majority of the votes for the wealthiest echelon of society, although it constituted only a small minority of the citizenry. As a result, the wealthiest echelon could ensure that the elected magistrates were always their own members. In turn, this ensured that the Senate was dominated by the wealthy classes, as its membership was composed almost entirely of current and former magistrates. Military officer role in the Polybian army of the mid-republic, equites held the exclusive right to serve as senior officers of the army. These were the 6 tribuni militum in each legion who were elected by the comitia at the start of each campaigning season and took turns to command the legion in pairs, the praefecti sociorum, commanders of the Italian Confederate ally, who were appointed by the consuls, and the 3 decurions that led each squadron of legionary cavalry. Cavalry Role. As the name implies, equites were liable to cavalry service in the legion of the mid-republic. They originally provided a legion's entire cavalry contingent, although from an early stage, when equestrian numbers had become insufficient, large numbers of young men from the first class of commoners were regularly volunteering for the service, which was considered more glamorous than the infantry. The cavalry role of equites dwindled after the Second Punic War, as the number of equestrians became insufficient to provide the senior officers of the army and general cavalrymen as well. Equites became exclusively an officer class, with the first class of commoners providing the legionary cavalry. Ethos. For the earliest times and throughout the Republican period, Roman equites subscribed, in the role as Roman cavalrymen, to an ethos of personal heroism and glory. This was motivated by the desire to justify the privileged status to the lower classes that provided the infantry ranks, to enhance the renown of the family name, and to augment the chances of subsequent political advancement in a martial society. For equites, a focus of the heroic ethos was the quest for spolia militaria, the stripped armor and weapons of a foe whom they had killed in single combat. There are many recorded instances. For example, Servilius Geminus Pollux, who went on to become consul in 202 BC, was reputed to have gained spolia 23 times. The higher the rank of the opponent killed in combat, the more prestigious the spolia, and none more so than spolia duci hostium detracta, spoils taken from an enemy leader himself. Many equites attempted to gain such an honor, but very few succeeded, for the obvious reason that enemy leaders were always surrounded by large numbers of elite bodyguards. One successful attempt, but with a tragic twist, was that of the decurion Titus Manlius Torquatus in 340 BC during the Latin War. Despite strict orders from the consuls not to engage the enemy, Manlius could not resist accepting a personal challenge from the commander of the Tusculan cavalry, which his squadron encountered while on reconnaissance. There ensued a fiercely contested joust with the opposing squadrons as spectators, Manlius once spearing his adversary after the latter was thrown by his horse. But when the triumphant young man presented the spoils to his father, the latter ordered his son's immediate execution for disobeying orders. Orders of Manlius became a proverbial army term for orders that must on no account be disregarded. Business activities. In 218 BC, the Lex Claudia restricted the commercial activity of senators and the sons, on the grounds that it was incompatible with the status. Senators were prohibited from owning ships of greater capacity than 300 amphorae, this being judged sufficient to carry the produce of their own landed estates but too small to conduct large-scale sea transportation. For this time onwards, senatorial families mostly invested the capital in land. All other equestrians remained free to invest the wealth, greatly increased by the growth of Rome's overseas empire after the Second Punic War. In large-scale commercial enterprises including mining and industry, as well as land, equestrians became especially prominent in tax farming and by 100 BC owned virtually all tax farming companies. During the late Republican era, the collection of most taxes was contracted out to private individuals or companies by competitive tender, with the contract for each province awarded to the publicanus who bid the highest advance to the state treasury on the estimated tax take of the province. The publicanus would then attempt to recoup his advance, with the right to retain any surplus collected as his profit. This system frequently resulted in extortion from the common people of the provinces, as unscrupulous publicani often sought to maximize the profit by demanding a much higher rates of tax than originally set by the government. The provincial governors whose duty it was to curb illegal demands were often bribed into acquiescence by the publicani. The system also led to political conflict between equites publicani and the majority of their fellow equites, especially senators, who as big landowners wanted to minimize the tax on land outside Italy, which was the main source of state revenue. This pernicious system was terminated by the first Roman emperor, Augustus, who transferred responsibility for tax collection from the publicani to provincial local authorities. Although the latter also frequently employed private companies to collect the tax quotas, it was in their own interests to curb extortion. During the imperial era, tax collectors were generally paid an agreed percentage of the amount collected. Equites publicani became prominent in banking activities such as money lending and money changing privileges. The official dress of equestrians was the tunica angusta clavia, worn underneath the toga, in such a manner that the stripe over the right shoulder was visible. Equites bore the title ex Romanus, were entitled to wear an annulus aureus on the left hand, and, from 67 BC, enjoyed privileged seats at games and public functions.